Welcome to the Carnegie Council. Our guest today is Gideon Rose, and he will be discussing his book, How Wars End, Why We Always Fight the Last Battle, A History of American Intervention from World War I to Afghanistan. I'm Joanne Myers, Director of Public Affairs Program, and on behalf of the Carnegie Council, I'd like to thank you all for joining us, and a special thank you to our newest trustee, Rich Edlin, who is sponsoring this program today, and thank you for your ongoing support. We are delighted to have Gideon Rose here to discuss his recent work, How Wars End, because in writing this book, Gideon raises an issue of vital concern, not only for the military establishment and policymakers, but for all those who care about America and our place in the world. The question he asks is why, when wars end, do we find ourselves at the mercy of events rather than in control of them? He states that time and time again, from World War I through the present, Washington has never really figured out how to disentangle itself from the fog of war. Our leaders, he says, concentrate more on defeating the enemy rather than focusing on the political aspects of war and creating a stable post-war environment. The past decade has provided painful confirmation of the truism that it is easier to start wars than to end them. The classic conclusion of war with the enemy surrendering in the wake of the unequivocal defeat of its forces has given way to messier outcomes dependent on managing complex political processes. Iraq is a perfect example where the goal of our military was met, but the United States was left presiding over a country rapidly spinning out of control, with officials having no plans or resources for what to do next as liberation turned into occupation and local ambivalence into insurgency until it was brought under control. In How Wars End, our speaker takes us through each major American war of the 20th century to show how confused political leaders often are about exactly what they are trying to achieve in the coming peace. Influenced by the writings of Karl von Clausewitz, the great Prussian military theorist, who defined war as a continuation of politics by other means and a belief that every act of war has to be judged by two distinct sets of criteria, political and military, Gideon used this philosophy as a guiding principle in conducting extensive interviews with those who participated in the decision-making of recent wars. In doing so, he vividly recreates the choices that presidents and their advisors confronted during the final stages of each major conflict. His descriptions make it very easy to imagine being in the room when decisions whose outcomes affected millions of lives and shaped the modern world were made. While the causes of war have received far more scholarly attention than their termination, this book is intended to adjust our thinking so that we will consider our future involvements and exits in a more decisive way. Accordingly, as we think about our exit strategy from Afghanistan, How Wars Ends is a book that Gideon hopes will help us to learn from our mistakes. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Gideon Rose. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much. It really is a great pleasure and privilege to be here. I've been to so many events at the Carnegie Council that I'm keenly aware both of how great an honor it is to speak here and how large shoes I have to fill. And I hope to make it as lively as possible. I've prepared a special version of this to annoy people because I know that in these kinds of sessions, the worst sin is to be boring and worthy. So I'll try to go beyond that, even though I hope to be worthy, but not at least be boring. As you just heard, the starting point for the book is Clausewitz's twin understanding of war, both as an active force to compel our enemy to do our will, as he says at one point, and as an active policy, the continuation of politics with other means, as he also says. Now, why does he define war twice, and how do these definitions relate to each other? Well, the answer is that war has two sides, a military side and a political side. It is the use of force. It involves violent means. If you were going about your various strategic and political ends without force, without violence, it wouldn't be war. It would be politics. It would be the normal stuff of international relations. But if you didn't have a political object, if you weren't trying to engage in some kind of political endeavor, the use of violence wouldn't be war either. It would just be banditry, or it would be crime, or it would be some kind of spasm of irrational action. What makes war war is the combination of violent means and political ends. That was the fundamental insight of Clausewitz. And the fundamental Clausewitzian challenge, I would argue, is how to harness force to policy. For a Clausewitzian, the chief goal of strategy is to use violence or force to achieve some rational political objective. That is what the endeavor is all about. And it's almost irrelevant for a Clausewitzian what the objective is, as long as you know what you're trying to do and you try to use your forces to achieve that. If that is in fact the case, as I believe it is, then the challenge of strategy is to set your political object, to devise a strategy to achieve it, and to essentially make sure that that is done. It's not, in effect, rocket science. It may be very difficult to do, but in theory, it's pretty simple to imagine. At one point, Clausewitz says, everything in war is simple, but the simplest thing is difficult for a whole variety of reasons. And I think that's basically correct. So part of the book is, in effect, this theoretical framework to say, here's how we should think about war. But what's interesting is that if you look in practice at how American policymakers, both military and civilian at the highest levels, approach the subject, in fact, they bollocks it up right and left every single time, practically. And they don't tend to do what Clausewitz says in the way that he says it should be done. And this doesn't mean that they fight the wrong wars, or they fight wars unnecessarily, or that they fight badly. It means that all those things may or may not be true depending on one's politics, depending on other things. What it means is that they don't think through the process and the endeavor as carefully and rigorously as they should. They don't tend to define for themselves what specific political end they're trying to achieve in an intelligent and wise manner, and they don't try to devise their strategy in order to accomplish that end. And so what they try to do usually is to avoid the mess inherent in the Clausewitzian framework, in which everything is linked to everything else, and create a sort of clear division of labor. To a practical person looking at this notion, well, you've got politics and you've got war, you've got generals and you've got civilian authorities. Surely it can't just be everything thrown into a blender and then, well, who's going to do what? How do you find a clear skein of thread through this whole muddle? Well, the logical thing to do for a practical person would be to say, you know what, let's create a division of responsibilities. Yes, there are political and there are military things, so let's divide it up. Let's have the civilian leaders take care of politics. Let's have the military leaders take care of military matters. And let's have a kind of nice, straightforward sequence in which you have the civilians decide on war, and you have them set the political objective. You have them turn the matters over to the military so that they then accomplish the goals, and then you have the generals turn things back over to the civilians and diplomats at the end to handle the post-war issues. That seems like an appropriate, logical way to go about this. No messy, everyone knows who's doing what, everyone knows when they're doing it and who's responsible. That should work out well. Logical and practical, it may seem on the surface, but in practice, this is the absolute worst way. Well, not the absolute worst, but it's one of the worst ways to do things, and it never works properly. Why? Because the heart of the Clausewitzian challenge is that it's not one thing in sequence followed by another thing. It's that the two things are inherently connected all throughout the operation. There is no such thing in military affairs as a purely military act for a Clausewitzian. And by the same token, everything is political, but your politicians don't necessarily know about military matters. So there's no substitute for a Clausewitzian for combining these things throughout. At one point, he says that to end a war successfully is the highest act of statesmanship. It is it is when the commander-in-chief turns simultaneously into a statesman. And he says this because the grand lines of war continue from war through the settlement into the post-war era. From that perspective, what Americans have generally done is they've focused on one thing first, which is the military aspect, the beating up the enemy, the negative aspect of war, and left the positive construction of some post-war settlement, the resolution of the political issues involved, to some later period after the fact. And what that has ultimately meant is when you approached those political questions at the end of the day, you had lost your leverage and you were also behind events and things had already started to take their course. And instead of, in effect, fighting the war so as to achieve your desired political outcome by treating them sequentially, when you were left dealing with the politics of it, you had no real plan for what to do next. And what the book does is, and I really hope people do read it, not just because it's good, but because it really says what I'm saying here. If you're at all interested in what I'm saying, read the book, because I detail these points which sound a little bit either silly or commonplace or whatever, or outlandish. I detail them all in the book very carefully, and so if something I'm saying doesn't sound right, it probably has a better logic to it that I can explain in the book. And particularly this is true of the historical cases, because the accusations that I'm making about the policymakers are not light ones. They are essentially a gross strategic irresponsibility on the part of our leaders, time and again, with very little excuse, except that they botched the job. That's a pretty serious charge to make, and I make it not lightly. I actually have served in government, and I reserve my highest accolades and my greatest admiration for Teddy Roosevelt's men in the arena, men and women in the arena, the people who actually get in there and try and do things. I am not a mere theorist. I am not a mere academic. I'm not somebody who sits on the sidelines kibitzing. I've served under very impressive people who got up every day and were public servants trying to make the world and American foreign policy a better place. And when they do their job right, or when they even give it a good faith effort and try to do the right thing and an intelligent thing, I have nothing but respect and admiration for them. And so what annoys me, it's precisely that professional rectitude and admiration for serious policymakers that makes me annoyed when it's not done properly. And so too often the failure to approach war seriously in its proper context leads to bad policymaking that could and should have been better. And what I do in the chapters of the book is I take the reader through every war, World War I, World War II in Europe and and Asia, the Korean War, Vietnam, the Gulf War, and Iraq, with a little bit on Afghanistan too, and basically show how these questions were faced by policymakers and often sort of why they ended up doing something that seemed suboptimal. And the short answer is that they tend to do things suboptimally because they don't think things through carefully enough in advance. They rely on improvisation later in the game, and they focus exclusively and prematurely on the negative aspects as opposed to the positive aspects. We all get so caught up in the enemy that we don't think about what is going to happen after the fighting stops. Just war theory says that you should fight war, it's appropriate here in the Carnegie Council on Ethics, you should fight war to achieve a better peace afterwards, right? Well, we don't tend to think about our peace, or rather, if we do think about the peace afterwards, we think about it in a negative way. Oh, we have to get rid of Hitler. Oh, we have to get rid of the Kaiser. Oh, we have to get rid of Saddam. Oh, we have to get rid of the Taliban. And that's all a necessary and important part of things. If you don't get rid of the bad guys who are causing the trouble in the first place, you're not going to be able to construct anything particularly good afterwards. But it's not by itself a sufficient answer to the question of what comes next. And the classic example of this, of course, is Iraq, right, in which we essentially keep seeing Saddam as the problem and Saddam's actions as the problem, and never really think about the larger question of Iraqi politics, Gulf stability, and so forth. So when the Bush administration in 2002 and 3 defines its goal in Iraq as regime change, and when it goes in and does a very good job of quickly knocking out Saddam's forces and in fact compelling Saddam to flee and captures Baghdad, and everyone celebrates and thinks that the end has come, in fact, that's only, and properly should have been understood from the beginning as, only the first step, right? Because, okay, you got rid of them, there's the now what question. My argument basically is that politicians invariably end up like Robert Redford at the end of the movie The Candidate, where they sort of get into office and then say, okay, now what? And if that's the only time you started to think about that question, you're going to be in real problems. And I could take you through all the cases, and there's a lot of really interesting stuff in the book on those cases. Actually, I'll just say one thing. Everyone criticizes George W. Bush with good reason. I mean, the Gulf War is about as, the Iraq War in 2003 is about as bad a case of this as exists in the record. It's almost paradigmatic. I actually wrote this as a dissertation first, and then put it aside for many years. And it's interesting. The paradigmatic case turned out to be done after the first draft of the book had been written. So I was glad to be proved right, although I feel a little guilty. Maybe if I had written the book when I should have 15 years ago, I would at least have been in a better position to say I told you so. Not that it would have changed anything, of course. But, it's easy to bash Bush feasts. It's harder to bash Bush père because in certain kinds of circles, not that it's harder, but in certain circles, here you have the great wise realists, the sober people who didn't do the bad Iraq thing and so forth. So, let's talk a little bit about Bush 1, or Bush 41, because it turns out they made exactly the same kind of mistakes, although a different subset, than as did the successor Bush. When Saddam invaded Kuwait in 1990, within literally the first 24 hours, the Bush administration had decided essentially, in the first 36 hours, the Bush administration had decided basically what it would do, which was to to oppose the invasion, to set itself on the reversal of the invasion without paying any price to Saddam, and to do that via a coalition, and to put in place a series of graduated measures, diplomatic sanctions, economic sanctions, and ultimately either air and then ground military sanctions to accomplish this, to push Saddam out of Kuwait. So in that sense, everything that happens from, let's say, the beginning of August, or after the invasion, from August 3rd, 1990, through the end of the Gulf War, is like the gun in Chekhov's dictum that appears in the first act and then is fired in the last act. Everything follows a script. But when Bush talks about the goals, he also says we're going to talk about, when he announces the first goals of the American enterprise in his first speech to the country, he says we're not just going to reverse the invasion of Kuwait, we're going to provide for the security and stability of the Persian Gulf. At this point, this is sort of boilerplate language that had been in American strategic discourse since the Carter Doctrine more than a decade earlier. And no one really knew what that meant or cared what it meant. It was sort of, okay, we say that in every speech on the region, so we'll say it again now. But it's interesting because they knew that they wanted to get Saddam out of Kuwait, but they didn't stop to think, okay, what happens afterward? And of course, to equate getting Saddam out of Kuwait with achieving the security and stability of the Gulf was a false equation, because once he wasn't in Kuwait in the beginning, and the Gulf obviously wasn't secure and stable because he came in. So the question then becomes, well, gee, once he's out, then what? So what the Bush administration never actually did, the first Bush administration, was define what it wanted beyond, what it needed, beyond getting Saddam out of Kuwait. And so you have this classic scene in which the end of the war, and I really can't do justice to it in the time I have here. Take a look at the book for the recounting of it. After Schwarzkopf's famous press conference about the mother of all battles and we've won the war, there's a scene in the White House where Bush gathers with his advisors in the Oval Office, and Colin Powell gives the classified version of the briefing that Schwarzkopf just gave, and they all sit around, and he says, Mr. President, I expect in about, by tomorrow I'll be able to come to you and tell you we've achieved all of our objectives. And then we should think about, the next steps. And Bush says, well, so you're saying it's over, we've won. He said, well, yeah. Bush says, well, if it's over, if it's going to do that tomorrow, how about tonight? And they said, well, that's interesting. And Sununu pops up and says, well, if we ended it at midnight tonight, that would be exactly 100 hours of the ground war. Right, 100 hours. Gee, that sounds nice. And everybody says, okay, anybody got a problem with ending it tonight? And Powell goes, that's interesting. Well, let me get Schwarzkopf in here. Let me get Norm in here on this. They go to the room, they pull out the phone. Norm, the president wants to, ask you, do you have any problem if we end it, midnight tonight, 8 a.m. tomorrow in the region? Schwarzkopf says, well, I don't know. Let me think about that. Well, maybe. Let me check with my commanders. Okay, yeah, sure, that's fine with me. I say that part, that's not in the record, but there's no record that he ever did check with his commanders, so that was functionally what he did. And he says, sure, that's fine. So they call back, okay, great. And so everyone's fine with this? Okay, good, let's break. We'll, you start briefing the Congress, you start briefing the allies, and I'll go on tonight and announce that kind of thing. They come out of this meeting in the White House, and the Oval Office, and their deputies are all there, or in their respective offices, and they say, oh, well, by the way, where are you going now? Well, I got to go brief Congress on the end of the war. What? Well, I got to go brief the allies. What do you mean? Yeah, we just decided to end the war midnight tonight. End the war midnight tonight? Who's, what? Well, that's what we're doing. And to a man, and I say to a man because at this point all the deputies were men, and I talked to several of them, they all thought this was silly. They all thought this was premature. They all thought that there was more stuff to be achieved. They didn't think it was necessarily going to end in disaster, but they didn't think that we had worked out the proper ideas for this. And they thought, you know what, I don't like this, but the bosses sort of have decided it, so we'll go and do it. And you actually have records of several of the deputies sort of saying this is a bad idea. And sure enough, we end the war, and all sorts of problems with the victory pop out, because it turns out that we don't have any plan for Iraq. We had been assuming that that the humiliating defeat Saddam suffered would lead to an insurrection within the army in Iraq, that would take care of the things, and you'd get some kind of Sunni dictator in Iraq, an authoritarian who would maintain some less nasty, less reckless version of Saddam's regime that would maintain stability in the region, and everything would be essentially status quo ante, but better. This doesn't happen. And instead you get the wrong people rising up. You get Saddam putting them down as we watch because we don't want to get involved. And then you sort of end up backing into a containment regime that you never had planned for and wanted. And all this stuff, none of it was rocket science. None of it couldn't have been predicted. In fact, some of it was predicted. But these guys had never wanted to consider the long-term aspects of what happens there. And to me, one of the things this encapsulates is, so you could almost see the book as, life as told by the deputies, right? In every professional organization I've been involved with, at least the well-run ones, there's usually a very wise senior professional standing there, shaking his or her head in disgust at the bosses and how they're doing some pretty silly thing that's going to end badly. And if they would only do the proper staff work before this, if they would only sort of pay attention to professional best practices, it would save everybody a lot of trouble. And you could, have somewhat lower expectations, plan it more carefully, achieve something better and solid. But that they end up being Cassandras. And that actually happens a lot. And so in some ways, I was trained by those types. So this is sort of history as seen by, the world as seen by the deputies. And in this case, it actually literally is the world as seen by the deputies, because a lot of them told me exactly this. And I quote, actually, one of them, there's at length in the book, there's a quote from Calvin Waller. It wasn't me, it was an interview that somebody else did with him, Schwarzkopf's deputy, who actually said there and says, listening to the press conference that we all heard with the mother of all battles, and says, no, that's not right. No, we're not there yet. I don't think I would go that far. No, we need another 20%. No, and yet goes along and sort of essentially doesn't get listened to. And the reason I say that is, here you have a classic situation of, George Bush Sr. with, Dick Cheney in his wise, reasonable form prior to the 1990s, with Colin Powell, everybody's favorite sage, with Brent Scowcroft, everybody's even more favorite sage. And these guys botch things because they don't think it through carefully and they don't plan carefully. So if that's, it's not just George W. Bush that screws it up. I often say, if you look at what's going to happen if Jeb wins and has to do with Iraq. I mean, you stay out of Baghdad, you get into trouble. You go to Baghdad, you get in trouble. The Bushes have tried everything. What's the next Bush going to try in Iraq if things go bad there, if he comes in? It's an interesting question. Okay, so I take this I take the reader through all this in the book. And at the end of the day, by the way, the strategic advice is pretty simple. It really is more common sense than you imagine. It's follow best practices, know what you're trying to achieve and why, figure out what you want the situation on the ground to look like before you go in, and monitor the execution carefully to make sure that happens, have backup plans for possible obvious contingencies in place, at least rudimentary ones, so that if things go better or much worse than you expect, or if your assumptions are wrong, you have at least the start of a plan B. and so forth. People say it can't really be that simple. Well, it's never that simple, but that would give you go a long way towards putting you in a good position to do things much better. And it turns out that in politics, as in real life more generally, or in war, as in real life more generally, common sense is actually very uncommon. But rather than, by the way, you could sum up the advice by saying that the Iraq War, in which you had post-war planning, was relegated to what they called Phase 4, stability and support operations, that it's no surprise that that was the one where they had the worst post-war planning in American history. Nobody in the world has ever gotten to item 4 on a to-do list, okay? So it's no surprise that Phase 4 was ignored. And in fact, I would argue that the simplest change you could make, the constructive change, would be to flip the ordering sequence so that instead of thinking of it as a progress from 1 through 4, with 4 being the settlement, think of it as a countdown. Think of 1 as here's the moon launch, here's the situation that we want to see at the end of the day. And then you have 4, 3, 2, 1, everything, because everything prior to the achievement of that situation that you want to see at the end of the day has meaning only insofar as it accomplishes that. And that to say that, for example, as someone like John Bolton does, that Iraq was going great up until the post-war stuff, which was done badly, is like the famous guy who jumps off the Empire State Building and is asked 80 floors later how things going, and he says, "Oh, it's going great," right? You only have the test of how it's done when you achieve the last stage, and so you can't judge the early phases of the war until you have it play out, and you would have them lead into the successful accomplishment of the underlying goals. So reversing the order so that you say, okay, here's how everything is focused on how we're going to get to 1 is the simplest way you could focus your mind properly. But with that, before I turn it over to questions, I want to say something even more, because again, we all know how to bash politicians. We all know how to bash, especially the Bush administration, even both Bush administrations. So let me say something a little more controversial in these quarters with the great and good assembled here. Something that will maybe annoy people a little more, or at least provoke them. As I was doing these cases, and I was focused on the individual politics of each war and the individual choices that decision makers were making, it struck me that there was, actually this came about when I was looking at the end of the Gulf War. And I was trying to say to myself, okay, hotshot, you're so smart, what would you have done, right? What was the great mistake that the Bush 1 team made? Was it that they should have gone to Baghdad? If not, how would they have avoided the other problems? If they didn't go to Baghdad, well, then what are you complaining about? And as I was thinking this, and I was trying to think, okay, look, if any good criticism has to imply a better alternative, otherwise it's not a good, valid criticism. And it struck me that what they really should have done was to decide for themselves in advance what they thought was achievable and desirable, and then design their war to that end. The short answer was they never really thought about Iraq. They knew what they didn't want. They knew that they didn't want to run Iraq after the war. They knew they didn't want to stay in the Persian Gulf. They knew they wanted to deal Saddam a defeat. So all the goals were negative. We'll deal Saddam a defeat. We'll avoid another Vietnam by keeping everything limited and quick and brief. We'll avoid colonialism and getting stuck in a quagmire. And we'll avoid Korea-style, endless, open-ended containment. Fine. That's what they thought they were going to achieve. But they never defined what they were going to achieve. They never defined what the positive outcome was. And if they had thought it through, what does security and stability in the Persian Gulf actually mean? They would have realized that the sad, unfortunate fact was that in a nasty region with an imbalance of power locally, with 2 nasty regimes at the top and a bunch of weak regimes that are American clients at the bottom and a huge amount of oil resources, that this region only had stability and security when there was some kind of provision of balance. And since the local conditions of balance weren't there, they would have to be provided. And since the British were no longer providing them, since they had pulled back from east of Suez, and since the Americans were no longer providing them via proxies like Saddam, and the Shah, and since the Americans were not able to balance them, like with Saddam, then there was no alternative to us basically stabilizing the region ourselves. And there were only two ways to do that. There was the Korean model, which is basically settle for half a loaf and a status quo ante, but stay there forever to make sure the thing doesn't blow up again. Or there was the somewhat more expansive World War II type model of go there and remake the bad guy so that it doesn't work. And that those really were the only two options, and they weren't particularly attractive ones, but hoping for a third that was nicer wasn't actually a good strategy. And so if they had asked themselves, which of these two do you really want, and then segued logically from the war plan to that outcome, it would have been better. I know people who think that the containment regime of the 1990s was about as least bad an option as you could get in the Persian Gulf. Everyone bashes containment, but no one really knew what we should do instead. And if that's what they honestly felt, if you were a tough-minded realist who said, you know what, a Korean peninsula type situation with Kuwait as the new Korea and Iraq as the North Korea, you know what, it's not optimal, it's not fun, but it's the least bad scenario we can think of, then you should have actually segued from the war to the post-war era. There were more people who died, there was more chaos and turmoil, there was more outrage in the month after our victory than there was during the war itself, because we didn't know what to do about Iraq itself. If you knew you were going to content to leave Saddam in power afterwards, then you should have essentially gotten to the outcome you got in a much more efficient, direct way, in a more sustainable way. You could have put in place we've had containment of North Korea for the last 60 years. We still need to do it, but because we thought through what it would involve, had achieved buy-in and did it carefully, the regime that we achieved in Korea, the containment regime, has lasted pretty durably and acceptably for several decades. If you had thought that was the best you could achieve in the Gulf, that's what you should have shot for. If, on the other hand, you thought, no, we can't possibly live with Saddam there for any reason, strategic, moral, what have you, then you should have had some kind of plan, not just to continue the war until he was removed, but some kind of plan for, okay, bright guys, so what do you do in Iraq afterward? What's your post-war plan for Iraq? The Bush administration, too, 43s, they knew they didn't want to do the first Gulf War. They knew they didn't want to do Clintonian nation building. But again, they had no real plan. They invented a light footprint, turn it over to the local Iraqis plan, not because there was any good reason to believe that would work, but because it allowed them to think they could escape both Bush 1's terrible realist compromises of leaving the bad guy in power and the Clintonian sort of nation-building quagmire approach that they didn't want to do in the Balkans and so forth. So this idea that you can define your option by the negatives, what you don't want, is bad. But thinking about this in the Persian Gulf, it made me realize that, you know what, the problems basically go away, or at least are contained, when America is involved. And that it struck me that what I was seeing across all my cases was a pattern playing out. You had wars about the balance of power in Europe, World War I, World War II. You had a sort of stabilization. You had three major global wars over the fate of Europe in the 20th century. World War I, World War II, and the Cold War. The United States enters late in the first one, decides it, and comes home. Second one, we enter earlier, we decide it, and we stay there. And because we stay there, and for other reasons as well, the third doesn't actually occur. So you have this pattern put in place in which you learn the lessons in Europe. You know what? Going away doesn't work. So you stay there. And we're still in Germany now. And you apply this lesson in Japan. You say, well, you know what? Why leave? We just take over the Japanese empire. We're going to build up a new Japan. We stay there. You apply this in Asia, and you end up with a balance of power in Asia as well with Korea. You stay there in Korea. You're in Korea. Vietnam is a distraction. We focus on that. You go in. It's a mistake. We pull out. But it doesn't affect the larger strategic pattern in Asia, which is the United States' presence has largely solved, or at least stabilized, the Asian balance of power. And then you have a new generation of wars in the Middle East, in Iraq I, Iraq II, and Afghanistan, that are essentially about the control and stabilization of the Middle East. It occurred to me that what you were seeing was nothing less than a progressive campaign of global pacification, in which the United States dealt with turmoil by essentially maintaining order itself, first over our own continent, then over our hemisphere, then over Europe, then over Asia, increasingly in the last generation struggling over the Middle East. We all know of a town in Iraq called Fallujah, right? This nest of vipers, these bad guys. And Fallujah, we dealt with once. We go in, we clear it out, and we come back. And what happens? It gets taken over by bad guys again. And so you go into Fallujah a second time, and you clear Fallujah out. And this time you stay. And this helps. The experience in Fallujah helps lead to the re-embracement of counterinsurgency doctrine and the clear, hold, and build strategy. And the clear, hold, and build strategy is you clear out the bad guys, you hold the territory, and you build the local government that will help a healthier political regime that will help secure it themselves. Well, I would argue that Germany is nothing but Fallujah writ large. What was World War I but a clearing operation of Germany? And then we go home. And what happens? A generation later, we find ourselves forced to come and clear Germany a second time. And we say to ourselves, you know what? This is really getting annoying. We don't want to have to do it a third time. So instead of leaving, we stay and we hold Germany. And we are holding Germany today. But holding something directly is costly and risky and unpleasant. And so it's much easier if you have some nice local allies to help you do it. And so we build a nice new Germany and a nice new Western Europe. And we have, I would argue, the European Union and our nice local Western allies in Europe as the built-up products who help us maintain and hold the gains and territory that we cleared twice before. And you know what? It's worked pretty well. We haven't had to clear that area again. Japan, we clear once. We say, aha, we learned this lesson before in Germany. We're going to hold this too. So we hold it and we build Japan. And we do it in Korea. We try to take all the continent, all the peninsula, and we say, no, that's a bridge too far when the Chinese come in. So we retreat to the halfway point. We take a half back, and we clear the south, we hold the south, and then eventually we help build a nice Korea. Now, by the way, the Korean example shows that you don't have to do the building all at once, right? You can leave the sort of nasty authoritarian local proxy, our classic sort of, SOB, but our SOB in place, and then let modernization and general development do the building for you to a certain extent. But you get the same outcome as in Germany and Japan, just separated by a couple of generations. And the question we have to face in the Gulf, I would argue, and in Afghanistan, and in the Middle East more generally, is if what I'm saying is true, then American involvement around the world has been nothing less than a kind of benign hegemonic presence, which has essentially, however unpleasant, costly, risky, been better than the alternatives. And that the alternatives have been chaos, disorder, tyranny, poverty, and general sort of mess. And that with the places we have gone and stayed have been the ones that have tended to do better. And if all you have to do is look at Korea today, and you see exactly what I'm talking about. We decided in the North that it was too much, too not worth it, and you know what? You could have it. You guys don't want to be part of the American empire? Fine, so be it. And you know what? 60 years later, almost, they're still a backward, tyrannical, impoverished, brutal place. And you know what? The area that you have a nice, good comparative case study. There wasn't all that much difference between North and South Korea in 1953. There's a hell of a lot of difference between North and South Korea today. There wasn't there was some difference in Eastern Europe and Western Europe, but it wasn't nearly as dramatic in 1945 as it was in 1989. And the implication here is that instead of thinking of these wars seriatim as individual sort of one-offs against a certain bad guy, we should link the wars to a larger pattern of American foreign policy in which our presence is actually quite a benign factor, and one in which that instead of thinking, you might say the Obama administration, by the way, has added transfer to the mantra. So the Obama administration's policy in Afghanistan, if you listen to it sometimes, is clear, hold, build, and transfer, as if no one ever wanted before them to transfer. The fact is that you can define American foreign policy in the 20th century as clearing, holding, and building around the world, waiting for transfers that never come. And the real question, and I'll leave you with this as we go into the questions, sorry for taking too much time, the real question for us practically speaking now, is not just the individual specifics of individual wars, but the bigger and broader question, and this is directly relevant to Afghanistan, directly relevant to Iraq too, to a certain extent, is where, given the incredible costs and difficulty and service involved in these benign, even by my own count, imperial interventions, which parts of the world, where is it so important to provide the benefice of American order that we're prepared to do it? And which parts of the world can and should we leave to function on their own devices, knowing that if we do not spread the blessings of American power, and I'm being deliberately provocative in saying this, not because I'm a hegemonist, because I want somebody to come back and give me an answer and I'll fight with you about it in the Q&A, which areas of the world should we leave to themselves and suffer the consequences of being outside the charmed circle? And if you look at the areas that have been outside the charmed circle of American power in the 20th century, you would all end up being like, Peter Sellers in The Mouse That Roared, saying, hey, can we attack you so that you can come and invade us, and then we can be part of the American empire too? Because it would be better to be South Korea than North Korea, better to be West Germany than East Germany, and I would dare say even better to be Kuwait than Iraq. The interesting question is, do we think that Afghanistan deserves to be part of that, needs to be part of that, or should we leave it in the category of Vietnam and say, you know what, our bad, we shouldn't have been in here in the first place, we should get out now, cut our losses, and leave you guys to fend for yourselves? And do we really want to do that? It's an interesting question. With that, I'll throw it open for Q&A.
As promised, you gave a very provocative discussion, but the dramatic presentation was a bonus, so thank you for that. I'd like to open the floor to questions, and I just ask that when the microphone comes to you, please identify yourself. John, you have your hand up.
John Hirsch, first of all, thank you very much. Both provocative, rather patronizing, rather Americocentric, all of the above. So even if your premise is accurate, which I'm not sure it is, what does one do with places of the world that would not want this American presence? In other words, one could argue that enough Germans and enough Japanese sort of bought into this that they accepted this presence, but presumably in Afghanistan, the Middle East, and so on, Pakistan, there's no interest in this whatsoever. Or at least I can't see it. So, I mean, does this only apply to these examples because we somehow, in a particular historical moment, kind of sold it to a certain number of people, Adenauer or Jean Monnet or somebody, but, we're not, seems to me very unlikely we're going to sell this to the King of Saudi Arabia or Zardari or, up in Kabul and so on. So could you sort of elaborate on this?
Well, I think it's a very good question. I think that we have sold it to the King of Saudi Arabia. He's a client in good standing. Whether the people of Saudi Arabia would agree with him, that's a different question. With regard to, I guess what you're saying is ultimately a question of the price of and difficulty of establishing such a hegemonic sphere of U.S. influence, because where it's unpopular, it's more costly, more difficult, more morally problematic to erect and sustain. And I certainly agree that that's the case. What I would say at that point is that all the more reason only to do this where necessary. And I would argue that in places like Vietnam, the mistake was not in prosecuting the war badly or in not having a good strategy, but in entering a war that you didn't need to enter, in mistakenly thinking you needed to be in a place. The logic of my argument is that when you really need to do this, there's no answer but to do it yourself. And it's America-centric because that's when things have gotten solved. And it's for what the locals think. If they're in a strategically important region, to a certain extent, you lose control and get put in a period of regency when you lose responsibility for your own security. We essentially, and this is, I have no problems whatsoever in sounding patronizing and paternalistic, we took European strategic affairs out of the hands of Europeans when they were shown to be unable to handle it to their own and our satisfaction. When we left European geopolitics to the Europeans, things didn't go well. Same thing happened with East Asian geopolitics. And you know what? The German army and the Japanese army have killed a lot fewer people in the half century since their countries were made part of the American quasi-empire than they did in the previous half century. And I would argue that that constitutes a justification for everybody else, whether or not it is accepted by the Germans and the Japanese, for the logic and benignity of what we actually ended up doing there. Now, the question of some other areas of the world, I guess, would be just how strategically important do you think Afghanistan and Pakistan is? I would argue that if you're in an area of the world that is not demonstrably and obviously strategically very significant, then you should probably not be playing this game for a whole variety of reasons. It's difficult, it's costly, it's expensive, it's probably going to be unwanted. And so the logic of that would be largely get out of, if that's the way one felt, you know, if you can't do it quickly and easily and with acceptance of the locals, maybe you want to think about not doing it at all. What that means in a truly strategically important area is an interesting question. The only area that is absolutely strategically critical now that I can see resisting that is the Persian Gulf. And, you know, we have enough willing clients and proxies in the Gulf to be able to maintain the necessary bit of control that we need to stabilize that region. And so I would essentially say the gravamen of your question would be get out of the places that don't want to do this, because it'll probably hurt them. Getting out will hurt them more than it will hurt us. Oh, sorry.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Picking up on the previous question, Afghanistan, we went in, we had the success relatively quickly, we withdrew. Same as the Russians, got bogged down, but we actually had victory, what appeared to be victory. Now we're back. There was sort of a holding pattern, exactly what we shouldn't have done without building up the local infrastructure. Now we're back. Now, for us, it's a war on terror, supposedly. So isn't it a different premise from the previous wars? Of course, there is no state really involved. They're harboring the al-Qaeda, and that's the same with Pakistan. Isn't that our concern, and isn't that a different parameter?
I don't think it is. I don't think it is because at root it comes down to the same thing. We are in a place because we feel that leaving that place to its own devices harms our interests. And whether that harms our interests, by the way, I'm cynical enough not to think that humanitarian reasons have been the primary reason behind our major conflicts. It has been a secondary reason for some major conflicts, and it has been a primary reason for some minor conflicts. But we are not so exceptional or humane that we've ever made humanitarian reasons the primary rationale for our major conflicts. So essentially, we're in the places that I'm talking about because we feel that we have to be and we need to be, and that the costs of being in are less than the costs of being out, costs and risks. We're in Afghanistan because when we weren't in Afghanistan, people flew planes into our buildings and killed people here. And we're there now still because we feel that if we left, there would be a risk of that happening again. Now, the people who say we should get out of Afghanistan, what they're really saying, and I, by the way, am totally open to this, but what they're really saying is, I am prepared to accept the risks of not being in Afghanistan rather than put up with the costs of being in Afghanistan. And that is precisely the debate that I think we're there. The fact of the indirect versus direct, it's groups that, if the Afghan government can't control its territory, and we have to control it for them to take care of the bad guys that are not the Afghan government, but the Afghan governments, that are operating from the badlands there. It's the same thing as if the Afghan government was doing it, because it means that the only way to deal with the problem is to establish control over that territory. It's ultimately about political order. Who has political order over a territory, and what are they using that to do? And whether it's the fact of a bad guy who has political control and is using it to do bad things, in some ways that's an easier challenge, and this may be one of the things you're talking about, which is not having control and having bad things flow from the chaos of lack of state, of statelessness, as opposed to a bad state. That is a different problem in how you deal with it, but it still puts the issue of, can we live with the problem, or do we have to find some way of dealing with it? And that's the interesting question. If we're comfortable with a higher risk rate, and again, it comes to a question of risk acceptance or risk aversion. I personally see the war on terror as being a giant insurance problem, right? There are floods, there are tornadoes, there are all sorts of risks that occur that we pay insurance to take care of. And we each have to say to ourselves, even beyond what the government mandates, how much insurance should I take out to deal with a low probability, high consequence, bad thing that could happen to me, right? That's exactly what terrorism is on the national security level. It is a low probability, high consequence, bad thing that could happen. All the various policies that we erect as part of the war on terror, including the bad things we have our intelligence services do, including the costs in our own life that we impose on ourselves through security measures, the military interventions and other things we engage in. All those things are, in effect, payments we make to, in our own mind, hold down the risks of that bad thing happening to us. And if you're prepared to accept the risks instead, or if you believe that, in fact, all that stuff is actually making the risks higher rather than lower, then we should stop doing those things and go about our lives and not be burdened by all this stuff. And that's actually certainly a legitimate and impressive kind of thing, if that makes any sense.
Howard Lentner. I agree with you in taking Clausewitz as a starting point in the relationship between force and politics, but I think in your interpretation and your overview, your provocative part of your talk, that you attribute too much to politics and you underestimate what can be attributed to violence and force. I mean, for example, the United States did not decide to leave North Korea alone. It was stopped militarily and was unwilling to go to war against China and probably the Soviet Union in order to gain part of that. So that was not a political decision. It was done by force. So was the end of World War II and the way we ended up in Europe. It was we did it by force, and we were stopped from extending our influence into Eastern Europe by Soviet power. But you also, it seems to me, underestimate the role that other people play. Well, let me just add Vietnam. We did not just choose to withdraw from Vietnam. We got defeated in Vietnam. But there's a role for other people as well. In the case of Western Europe and Japan, for example, you had a culture, an economic system, and a political system that provided a base for building the prosperity and so forth that have come from that, and that would put them in a position where they could then choose to ally with us. So I think that, well, it's just, I think that I want to argue that there's a different interpretation from yours, and that I just wanted to make that point.
I would say two quick things about that very quickly. The first is, it's fascinating. When you look at any individual choice, policymakers almost invariably see themselves as deeply constrained. And when you look at it through a broad historical perspective, it almost seemed that history had to go a particular way because that's the way it went, and it's very easy to see all the things that led it to be that. But if you probe that a little more carefully, and if we ask ourselves, gee, what happens tomorrow, what happens the next day, it's actually a lot less constrained than people think. And I think that there is a lot of choice involved. We were defeated in Vietnam. We could have stayed there. We chose from 1968 on not to bear the costs of the war. The North Vietnamese could never have pushed us out. We chose not to continue bearing the costs of an ongoing war because we felt it wasn't worth it. Now, it's a perfectly legitimate choice. In North Korea, we could have dropped. We had a nuclear bomb. We had more troops. We ultimately decided that the costs of staying in the North were not sufficient, were too great to merit the staying. So I think that even though we often tell ourselves stories about constraint, and often though the military costs, I don't mean to say it's a choice that's an unconstrained choice. It's just that it's a choice you make at the end of the day about resources, what's vital, what's not vital, and you can often surprise yourself by doing more when you really think it's necessary. With regard to the second thing, it's interesting. It may be true what you're saying about Europe and Japan, Germany and Japan. It's harder to see that in prospect than it is in retrospect. If you had said in 1945, Germany is about now to embark on successful democratization, the Germans are pacifist at heart, democratic at heart, and will be fine. The Japanese will turn themselves on a dime into a Pacific country of Democrats after, oh, by the way, yeah, that quasi-fascist imperial Japanese military regime. People would have looked at you like you were crazy. And it may be true, what you're saying, but it's harder to know in advance. If you had said, Weber thought the Catholics couldn't economically develop. If you had said to people in the 1950s that South Korea will be a member of the OECD in a few decades, they would look at you and laugh and think, what are you smoking? Can I have some of that, please? So things have happened that we didn't expect to happen, and things haven't happened that we did expect to happen. And so while I agree you need to factor in those calculations, factor in those issues you're talking about, the preconditions and so forth, into your calculations about what is feasible and not, it's much harder to make deterministic predictions than one might expect looking at the cases in retrospect. That's all I'd say.
Unfortunately, our time has come to an end.
Well, I'll be around if people want to talk a little bit.
I would like to invite you all to join us in a drink, and Gideon will be happy to sell his book and sign it. Thank you, Gideon.